In this step of setting up our recast workflow, we're going to create the recast spec files which encode the recast workflow. So these are the steps in workflow.yaml file, as well as the steering file recast.yaml, and the .gitlab ci.yaml that encodes our CI job to automatically test our workflow. So the approach that's suggested for this in the recast docs, if we go into workflow authoring slash introduction and go down to the step-by-step guide, is to copy these recast spec files in the Hello World example into our GitLab project and use those as a starting point to build our recast workflow off of. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to this GitLab project that just got created for our toy analysis, and I'm going to clone it and clone it into clone it locally rather. Okay. And now we can copy the spec files in this Hello World example into the GitLab project. And you can see that now there's a README, a steps.yaml, and a workflow.yaml in the specs directory. And then there's also this recast.yaml steering spec and a .gitlab CI file for workflow or for setting up a CI job to automatically test the workflow. So if we take a look at the steps.yaml file, we'll just go through it a little bit. So this has one step, and it's basically just a skeleton to illustrate what the steps.yaml file should look like. So we have first this process field, and this specifies the process that's actually going to run in this step. So in this case, it's just a simple bash script, which prints out a short message, which uses an input variable name, and then it outputs that message into an output variable output file. And then this output file gets published in the publisher field. So it gets published to an output variable with the same name output file. And then in the environment field, this is specifying that the step is going to run in a Docker container, which is created from the BusyBox image with the image tag 1.33. And then if we look at the workflow.yaml, this is specifying the input and output for the step. So it's saying, first of all, that the only dependency for the step is the input that gets provided to the workflow. So that's what this init is saying. And then it's also specifying the parameters that get input and output by the step. So this name gets input based on the step init. And then the output file gets output to workdir / hello world. And this workdir is a directory that's unique to each step in the workflow. And so this workdir is just basically a variable representing the path to that unique directory for this individual step. And then the step is specifying that this workflow stage is providing the or specifying the input and output for the hello world step that we just looked at in the steps.yaml file. Now we can take a look at the recast.yaml. So this is specifying, first of all, a name for the workflow. So it's currently called examples/hello world. And then there's some metadata which we can update. And then it's also specifying where the recast Atlas client needs to look for the workflow.yaml file, or rather what the name of the YAML file is. And then it provides some example inputs. So in this case, the only input to the workflow is this name variable, and it's providing a value for that variable. And then lastly, the results field is specifying what actually gets output by the workflow. So it's providing a name for the result and also a path where the recast Atlas client should look for the workflow output that is the ultimate result of the workflow. And then lastly, we can look at the .gitlab CI. So this is providing an automated test of the workflow. So it's first of all specifying that the workflow will run in this image that already has the Recast Atlas client pre-installed. And it has these lines to do the authentication. In this case, we don't actually need any authentication because we're not trying to access any inputs from EOS. But when we do have inputs being read in from EOS using xrootd, for example, we will need to authenticate with these lines. And then these lines here are adding our workflow to the recast catalog, and then checking that the workflow is healthy, and then lastly running our workflow with the input that got specified in the recast.yaml file. And then it's also producing the output of the workflow as a GitLab CI artifact. So I'm gonna commit these files and push them to the GitLab project. Now we can go over to the project and we see that that the files are there now, so that's good. And it looks like, yeah, there's a pipeline pending, so it hasn't started running yet. So while we wait for the workflow to get started and hopefully finish, we can also try running the recast workflow locally. So to do that, we can go down to, let's see, right, to running the workflow locally using Docker. So the first thing that we need to do is install the Recast Atlas client. So we can do that in a Python virtual environment, which we'll set up now. Oops, just need to update pip. Okay, so we've already cloned our repository, so we can just directly add our workflow to the catalog. Okay, and we can use this recast catalog ls to check that we now have an example / hello world in the catalog. And then I'm just trying to remember the exact syntax. Right, we can also check it using this recast catalog check. So yeah, it looks like it's healthy. So that's great. And now this step isn't strictly necessary for us because we don't need any authentication to access stuff from EOS, but we might as well do it anyway just to get that set up. So this first line is setting up the recast user, recast pass, and recast token variables. And these are, first of all, the username that we're going to use to authenticate, the password, and the recast token, or sorry, the GitLab token that we want to use for authentication. So if you haven't set up a GitLab token yet, there's some instructions, I think, linked up top in the docs. Yeah, so there's a link here to some instructions for setting up your personal access token. So you can follow these if you haven't done it before. Okay, so yeah, I can, so I'm gonna set the recast user to my username. And then I'm gonna pause the video while I put in the recast pass and recast token. So I'll be back in a moment. Now that I've set up my recast pass and recast token environment variables, I can run this line to set up the authentication for the recast Atlas client using these this username and password and GitLab token. So it looks like the login was successful. That's good. And now this next command is used to create this authdir directory, which just it contains a kinit command that uses my CERN credentials, which I specified with these 3 environment variables, to set up the Kerberos authentication to copy inputs from EOS into the workflow using xrootd or whatever. So I'll also run that to create this authdir. And you can see that that directory got created. Okay, so now that the authentication is set up, I'm going to run the recast workflow. And remember, in this particular case, we didn't actually need to set up the authentication because we're not copying any inputs from EOS yet, but we might as well set it up now so that it's ready to go when we do need it. So, okay, I'll run the workflow using this recast run command, and hopefully it'll run okay. Okay, this is looking good. So it says that recast has finished and it's written the output files into this directory recast dot dash a bunch of letters and numbers. And it's also produced the output that was specified in the recast.yaml file. So this value and the string that got written out into the output file. And I also want to just show you where the workflow outputs actually get written to. So if we do an ls in this recast dash a bunch of letters and numbers directory, there's this hello world directory inside it. And if we do an ls in there, we see that that is where the Recast Atlas client actually wrote this hello world.txt that got produced in the hello world step. So what that means is this hello world directory corresponds to the work dir that I was talking about in the spec/workflow.yaml file. So this work dir variable is a path to that this hello world directory where the Recast Atlas client is outputting these workflow files. Okay, so it looks like everything is good locally, and we can go over to the GitLab project and see that it looks like the pipeline has also been successful in the GitLab CI project, so that's good. It also produced the expected output, and that output is available as an artifact of the job, so we can download it if we want to and take a look at it locally. So it looks like everything is set up, and now we can use this sort of skeleton setup to encode the workflow for our particular analysis. So that's what we're going to do in the next step.